I did have to muse at the timing of this launch. It's a coincidence, but still poetic. Against the backdrop of self-destructing 13th and 14th gen Intel, AMD releases these, the Ryzen 9000 CPUs, 9600X and 9700X, 265-watt TDP parts that sip power while delivering phenomenal performance. Welcome to Machines and More. Ryzen 9000. Today's the launch for both the 9600X and 9700X. We'll review both CPUs today. Lots to talk about with this first round of Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 CPUs. I'll highlight what's new. We'll take a look at some performance benchmarks, and I'll give you some brief insight into how you might set up your CPU if you do get one of these. A more detailed video will be coming. And then I'll wrap up with my recommendation on whether you should get either of these two CPUs. First off, big thanks to AMD for their support of the channel and providing the CPUs for review testing today. However, this review is not sponsored by them, and all of my testing is done so independently. If you enjoy hardware content like this, I will be doing a lot of Zen 5 content in the next few weeks, so please give a like and make sure you're subscribed. It really helps the channel, and big thanks. Let's talk CPUs. 6-core, 12-threaded Ryzen 5 9600X and the 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 7 9700X are the first two that are launching from AMD's new Zen 5 series, 9000 series of CPUs. The big one is the process change. These CPUs are built on TSMC's 4nm process node. Ryzen 7000 was 5 nano, and the tangible improvement for the end users is a lower power draw and increased power efficiency. And some of you might have seen my coverage of the announcement at Computex this year when Dr. Lisa Su announced these, and immediately what caught my eye was a 65-watt TDP spec for both the 9600X and 9700X SKUs, and that's compared to 105 watts TDP on both the 7600X and 7700X. In fact, outside of the 5700X, which is just a bin down 5800X, the Ryzen 7 X SKUs are usually 105 TDP, and Ryzen 5 X SKUs have varied. The most recent gen, the 7600X, went to 105 TDP from 65 watts on the 5600X, so this number is a big deal. So I don't usually lead with graphs, but I feel like this one is important to put up front because it's, to me, worth 1,000 words. Just for reference, AMD's 65-watt TDP spec means a PPT of 88 watts, and 105 watts TDP translates to a max of 142 watts PPT. So as you'll see throughout today's review, to me the key word here is efficiency. And out of the gate, both the 9600X and 9700X will be immediately friendly to those that are cooling limited. Although not to those that flat out have no cooler though, because these still don't come with a box cooler. But many of you that are subbed to the channel enjoy our SFF content here. In a space-limited case, these are perfect with small coolers. And on the flip side, if you have enough thermal headroom, the low starting TDP means you have quite a bit of headroom to play with, even if you just upgrade to a slightly above average cooling solution. And if you want to push the chip a little bit, in fact, they do a lot better with just a few tweaks. AMD has made big gains in their instructions per cycle, or IPC, so much so that they are able to just reduce the out-of-the-box power spec and the clocks for Ryzen 9000. One thing they claimed was a geomean improvement of 16% on the IPC. I just did a quick test, just a blender benchmark, locking the clocks to the same 5.3 gigahertz. The 9600X yielded about 15% more samples, so that 16% is definitely plausible. The associated render time dropped by about 14%, so definitely in the ballpark there. Previously, you could enable eco mode for the higher TDP SKUs for an effective drop in TDP category. In other words, you could drop down to a 65-watt TDP from a 105-watt TDP chip by enabling the eco mode. In some sense, these feel like they're upside down. These feel like higher TDP capable CPUs that were released with eco mode enabled, and if you want, you can then unbridle your Mustang. Because of that, the all-core behavior is very different versus the 105-watt TDP Zen 4 chips. With Zen 4, you would usually see the all-core boost above 5 gigahertz if you give it enough cooling. Here, the 96X boosts up to only 4.9 gigahertz, and with the 9700X, I would expect more or less the same. But the latest AGSA 1.2.00, at least for the 9700X, feels a little bit tame. And I'm guessing that'll probably change in an update soon. But I tested with two different boards, both clocked in at 4.45 gigahertz on all cores when fully loaded. So, it is what it is right now, and we'll see what happens going forward. Gaming clocks were lower out of the box versus Ryzen 7000 as well, which is fine because of the IPC gain here. Both the 9600X and 9700X seem to boost to 5.3 gigahertz, 5.35 gigahertz max on a single core. The 9600X does seem to be boosting to AMD's spec of 5.4 gigahertz max on a single core. But as mentioned, for the 9700X, I was noticing lower clocks than expected, and we are short of the 5.5 gigahertz on a single core max that AMD specs for the 9700X. So likely there's going to be some board BIOS refinements or microcode refinements that are warranted to get to that point. With a curve optimizer offset of just -15, which most chips can do, I was easily seeing 5.45, 5.5 gigahertz on the 9700X, so a little bit of tuning is all you need for these chips. The lower starting power draw means the stock all-core temps are very, very reasonable. The way Ryzen 7000 worked was, let's push the chip towards 95 degrees, almost invariably. This, on a 360 full fan speeds, Ryzen 9000 does not appear to work the same way. Okay, overkill cooling and fan speeds, but this is to kind of demonstrate it does not do that. It's the same used for all CPUs throughout, right? And then perhaps it's a comical graph, but the difference will translate across to simpler cooling solutions as well. Lower stock power behavior is different, but the thermal design itself is also improved. You will get better temps even at the same power levels. AMD says up to about 7 degrees. The actuals are going to depend on the comparison wattage, of course, but comparing a 7700X and 9700X here at 88 watts PPT and also 135 watts PPT, I think that's a reasonable estimate. So all this adds up to an easy to run, easy to live with, and still very powerful CPU. One interesting tidbit based on my testing, we'll see this again later, at stock settings, the 9700X ran as well on a small Noctua L12S by 77 in the Fractal Terra as it did in the bigger test system with a 360 rad. Other differences here, the cache bandwidth is improved. Biggest change is the L2 cache. It's all about double the speed on that. That's very impressive. The L3 cache itself is increased, a modest bump up. You get 6 additional megabytes on the 9600X and 8 additional megabytes for a total of 40 on 9700X. Not 96 like the 7800X 3D, but nonetheless, it's a good boost. And also an increase in speeds, reduced latency on that L3 cache. RAM up to DDR5 8000 now is going to be possible. The new threshold of what AMD considers a RAM OC versus non-OC is 5600 MHz, and previously that was 5200 MHz. The fabric clock is still desynced. Auto or default will now be 1600 to 1800 MHz depending on the kit that's being used, but with Expo or XMP enabled, you'll see 2000 again. Same boost algorithm, PBO2, you can still OC and undervolt with the curve optimizer functionality, and that's how I would recommend doing it. But one thing many of you will like is that they're adding the ability to fine-tune that curve offset at different points with what they're calling Curve Shaper. Still on the AM5 socket, if you get in right now, you'll need a 600 series board, which is what I tested with, but 800 series boards are coming. There will be boards with X870E, X870, B850 chipsets, and an interesting B840 SKU, which seems like it'll be similar to the A620 chipset right now. I picked quite a few CPUs to retest as comparison data points. The main ones to look at, in addition to the Ryzen 7000 counterparts, are going to be the 14600K on the Intel side. That is a 6 performance core plus 8 efficiency core, which is a total 14 core chip. And for gaming, the 7800X 3D, which if you're not familiar with this SKU, it's an 8-core Ryzen 7000 CPU with a gaming emphasis as it has a whopping 96 megabyte L3 cache. The main test system here was the Lian Li A3 mini-itx equipped with 360mm rad. All CPUs were run at stock settings, with DDR5 clocked at AMD's recommended 6000 MHz, except for the 5800X 3D, which is a DDR4 3200. CPUs were liquid cooled, except the 5800X 3D, which was in my legacy system on a Noctua U12A air cooler, which is more than sufficient for the X3D CPUs, and GPU was the 4080 Super Founders Edition throughout. Quick note, boards as of right now, they're still getting their BIOSes ironed out, so for quite some time now, 600 series board BIOSes could already boot Zen 5. But for the most optimized performance to date, you will need a BIOS based on a G-SIB 1.2.00. And for the main testing, I used the Gigabyte B650M Aorus Elite, And you'll see a few benchmarks in an SFF system where I used my MSI B650 Ion. One final note, my testing straddled the whole 13th and 14th gen Intel fiasco. So I had already tested with the 14600K, which was run with the older microcode, and the 14700K was with the updated, safe, new microcode. I haven't tested that change specifically, but both chips seem to run well, as you'll see. Starting with some synthetics, Cinebench R23 and R24 multi-core, the 9600X is 12 to 16% better than the 7600X. It doesn't quite catch the 8-core 7800X 3D, but it does get awfully close. Interesting thing I saw was that the 9700X was only about 1.5% to 3.5% better right now versus 7700X. Like I mentioned, the boards seem to run this one a bit slow, and my X670E happened to croak just before the testing. So unfortunately, I didn't get to test with that, but I saw similar clocks across both B650 boards. So ultimately, I do expect gains that are more similar to 9600X versus 7600X when the board BIOSes get refined. And mainly that's because if you look at the single core gains, they really should scale. For both SKUs, between 15 to 21% improvement for single core Cinebench over these Zen 4 counterparts. So for single core performance, these are going to be the top players now. So I mentioned eco mode earlier. If you run the 7700X on eco, you end up at the same package power target as stock 9700X. So comparing there, I'm seeing about a 10% improvement on this power normalized basis. Running the 9700X at 135 watts to match what I usually see on the 7700X, you get a 17% bump up. 9600X at 100 watts is about 13% better, and that's a very important metric because many of you that have adequate cooling can choose to just up the power limits, and these will run just fine and incredible like that. So well done on the power and efficiency by AMD. 3D Mark times by CPU score, the smaller gains here, 1 to 2%, a little bit of a mix. Some productivity reference points, Blender CPU render, big improvement. The 9600X gets a boost of almost 20% in samples per minute. The 9700X about 8%. 9700X versus 9600X, the Ryzen 7 SKU is about 32% faster, which is kind of what you would expect going from a 6-core to 8-core, and that's 33% mathematically. If you do video editing like I do, the DaVinci Resolve benchmark factors in the GPU. So realistically, smaller gains if more of the burden is being passed on to the GPU here. Geekbench 6 gets us an approximation, reasonable approximation for day-to-day to moderately intensive productivity, seeing a 6 to 11% improvement with the new CPUs. So in general, compared to the Intel SKUs for heavy multi-threaded workloads, Ryzen 9000 is still at a huge core disadvantage because it didn't have those E-cores. And the two new AMD chips won't catch either. But if you consider the power that's consumed for the same task, just use this Blender render here. Ryzen 9000 is beautifully efficient. You don't need a big cooler for either of these chips. For the 7700X, liquid cooling or a bigger air cooler was still going to be the safer bet. But if you compare the 9700X on a 360 rad at full speed versus the small but mighty Noctua L12S by 77, I saw very little difference other than likely the impact of the board BIOS, and I love this. So I'll cover SFF and GPU limited scenarios specifically in its own video, so do stay tuned for that. Alright, gaming, I try to pick a variety of titles that span the FPS, RTS, turn-based, some AAA, some old, some new, just run the gamut, just to get a little bit of everything. Of course, for the marketing material, you'll often see cherry-picked numbers, but hopefully these are a little bit more real world. 1080p will be more CPU limited, so those will tend to show the big differences. And I'll also have 1440p as a reference point as well. It's a very popular resolution, although you'll often hit a GPU limit there. I'll talk through the ones where there's noticeable impact, and I'll just throw up the remainder for you to peruse, and I'll talk about the mean. Far Cry 6 is one of those where it's so CPU sensitive. The GPU often doesn't get full utilization because of that. The 9700X and 9600X, they both run this tile very well. There's about a 20%-ish or so improvement for Ryzen 7 at both resolutions and about 6 to 8% for the Ryzen 5. The 7800X is still easily the best here. 14600K is very competitive as well here, just a tad behind the 9700X, while a lot better than the 9600X, and the 14th gen chips are very solid for gaming in general. One of AMD's highlights was that the 9700X would be about 12% faster than the 5800X 3D while using less power in gaming based on their selected titles. And while I do see that the 9700X is better here, it's only by a little bit, and the 5800X3 is still very competitive, and both chips tend to draw similar levels of power for gaming. Chip does have a bundled Radeon iGPU. It's still not good enough to play AAA titles, even at 720. Mainly this one is for debugging purposes, and you definitely want a discrete card with either of these CPUs. MSFS 2020 is going to be one of those where the big L3 cache of the 7800X3D and the 5000X3D are going to give it big advantages. Interestingly, while neither Zen 5 chip closes the gap completely against the 7800X3D, they both do quite well, and about a 7 to 12% improvement here over Zen 4, likely due to the cache improvements we talked about earlier. Overall, the 3DV cache is still a big deal, and the 5800X3D still has a very impressive showing throughout. So 6 has a different type of gaming benchmark. It's a turn time benchmark for this turn-based strategy game, which does typically scale with the CPU's all-core capabilities. Here, the 9700X catches the 7900X, and 9600X catches the 7700X, and both are pretty similar to their Core i5 and Core i7 counterparts. You might have noticed that in some of the extended benchmarks that the Ryzen 9000 CPUs we're looking at today fell behind their Ryzen 7000 counterparts, likely a result of those clock frequencies that we saw that perhaps not living up to the expectations just yet on the current AGISA. I'm sure that's going to work itself out. Usually at this stage of the game, there's going to be some bumps in the road, but with the IPC and the single core performance gains that we saw in the synthetics, those particular benchmarks are likely just anomalies at this point in time. Let's take a look at the GMean for 9 titles. As a whole, the recent gen CPUs are all solid gaming CPUs. At the top of the 7800X3D, it's not going to be caught. While it's not the strongest productivity performer, the 5800X3D is still an absolute beast of a chip for gaming. The 9600X and 9700X do pass it at 1080, but only just. And this one is still very much relevant in 2024. So if you are looking to stick with the gaming focused chip, then definitely hold out for the Ryzen 9000 X3D chips. And even then, I still think the 5800X3 is going to be very competitive. Based on my metrics, the 9700X and 9600X are not far behind the 14700K, 14600K respectively, but they don't pass them. In reality, as a whole, the performance differences between those four are not going to be meaningful, especially for folks that will be GPU limited, especially at higher resolutions like 1440p or 4K. And I'll just pick based on other factors that are more tangible, such as power efficiency. This basically shows the package power the CPU uses while gaming. And lower power, it's not just a lower power bill. Factors that are more noticeable are fan noise, cooling requirements, the cost of the cooler itself, or making a room really hot in the summer, that kind of thing. Given the choice, I would always choose the more efficient ones on a like-for-like basis. There are a few optimizations that you can do with these, and I'll cover these in a dedicated video soon, but at a high level, one is you can absolutely overclock and run these at higher power levels, and they almost seem like they're supposed to be used that way in some sense. The best way to do this is to adjust the power limits while also shifting the voltage curve to get a higher boost clock. Most CPUs should be able to run a negative 10 to 15 all-core some more. Your mileage is going to vary here. But I would also advise setting some sort of power limit, because otherwise the CPU is just going to do the same thing as Ryzen 7000 and boost up to that thermal throttle point of 95 degrees, and also lift that CPU boost ceiling to positive. I just put a positive 200. Using Cinebench as an approximation, setting the -15 offset for the 9700X yields a 21% boost. It runs up to 155 watts and 95 degrees. If you set a 135 watt limit, which is closer to the 7700X at stock, that's a 16% boost. If you didn't dial in the curve offset, which means lower boost clocks at the same power level, you still get about a 15% gain over stock. So interestingly, compared to the 7700X, which boosts to a similar power level, the 9700X has a gain of about 17% over it. So the power normalized gain of Zen 5 chips are going to be huge. So this definitely woke up the 9700X a bit over the sleepy stock behavior we're seeing. Another thing you could do is set that curve offset while maintaining the 88 watt stock power limit. You'll end up with better performance at similar thermals, and that way if you're cooling limited, this is a great way to boost up the chip without extra fan noise or cooling requirements. Next level would be, you could set an even lower power limit than 88 watts, and with an adequate curve offset, you could end up with lower temps, but it's the same performance as a stock CPU. So those are 3 options that you have to start with. Usually the curve optimizer settings will affect the chip more for multi-threaded performance, and so for things like gaming, the impact is going to be small. In my experience, though, if you set a heavier curve offset like -30 or -35, though, your system may run just fine at load, but then it's going to crash at light loads. That same offset is being applied all throughout the voltage curve, even though it shouldn't. The new curve shaper feature will allow you to dial down the offset at the certain intervals. So if you're having stability issues, you can kind of fine tune it this way. It's something that you couldn't do previously. I think this is really neat if you're trying to dial in the perfect curve optimized offset. So 9700X and 9600X, excellent CPUs. Reference pricing I got was $280 for the 9600X and $360 for the 9700X, which is cheaper than how the 7700X and 7600X launched about 2 years ago. So I say this is a very reasonable, very attractive entry point. That makes the 9600X cheaper than the $300 14600K, which of course does have much stronger multi-core performance, and even the 9700X will not catch the performance from the extra E-cores of the 14600K. However, those are dead-end sockets, and I haven't recommended them for my SFF builds in the past. Now with the self-destructing issues that Intel is having and the goodwill that they've squandered and just how inefficient those chips are in general, I really have an even more difficult time recommending them. So I'm just a big fan of how graceful the new architecture and process is from AMD, as well as how long they've supported the AM4 socket. And AM5, they're saying, will still continue on through 2027 and onwards, which is very impressive and promising. At this point, my impression is that at least for this launch, the only competition that AMD has is, well, AMD. In typical fashion, the 7600X and 7700X have both dropped in price. The 7600X is going to be $200 at some retailers now, and the 7700X about $290. So if you're looking to build a new system or looking to upgrade from AM4 and something older, if you're not cooling limited, the Ryzen 7000 prices are very attractive as well. For example, the 7700X is going to be just a few more dollars than the 9600X, and the 9600X won't catch the extra 2 cores for multi-threaded performance, right? And the gaming performance is still more similar than not. So if you could use the extra multi-core performance, the 7700X is a great bargain, as is the 7600X for a budget gaming system. It wouldn't be appropriate to say, though, that the 9600X, because it's 40% more in terms of the price than the 7600X, and you're not getting 40% additional performance, is totally not worth it, right? Because you do have to consider the percentage from a total system cost perspective, right? So the way to frame the decision is the enhanced experience worth $80 or $90 more for Ryzen 9000 versus 7000 when you're building up a new system? And you don't need a serious cooler for either 9600X or 9700X, because the difference between a 240, for example, on a small tower like the Peerless Assassin Mini, which you could run in the NKSM2, that's pretty significant, and that could easily be the difference, or at least close the gap significantly between the 9700X and 7700X. And even if you were to get the 7700X and say just leave it at eco mode, you're leaving a good bit of performance at this point on the table, and 9700X is still going to run cooler. If I haven't emphasized it enough, I love AMD's efficiency focus with Zen 5 though. Out of the box, they're not overwhelmingly better than the Ryzen 7000 counterparts, but you can choose the form of your gains here. If you want power efficiency, you want a quiet system, low-key cooling, just leave it at stock. If you want more multi-core power, then it's absolutely there. You just have to lift the power limits to a higher TDP target. So that philosophy, it works well across the spectrum of users, right? Because on one end, you got the totally new to this, just want to set my DIY PC up and never touch anything else in BIOS. It'll work well and quietly. You won't get that, oh, why is my chip at 95 degrees type of rude awakening, right? If you're an enthusiast, you know what you're doing. You got plenty of fun left for you here to unlock, and I really do plan on pushing these to see how far I can get with them. That for me is the most compelling reason to go with either of the two new Ryzen SKUs, and I'll definitely be recommending these for my SFF builds going forward, especially the 9700X, since you now have a powerful but not power hungry 8-core SKU. It's not something we've really had before. It's more productivity focused than the 7000X 3D. And especially if you are an SFF enthusiast, you could build something like this. This is a Fractal Terra sub 10 liter 9700X build. You don't have to worry about adequate cooling. You can run it on something like this, just a small top-down cooler like this, ID cooling IS67, and that's going to work very well as well. We'll talk specifically about Ryzen 9000 in SFF soon. You got board prices and selection that are more reasonable now as well. We got 800 series boards that are coming in also, so it's just a wonderful time to get into AM5. So hope you enjoyed this perspective. More CPUs are coming up. I'm also going to be doing, like I said, the more SFF specific perspective on Ryzen 9000. I'll give you some setup tips, some cooler recommendations, board recommendations. So lots more content inbound. Make sure you're subscribed. Please give a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Check out the links for the CPUs down below. Big thanks for watching today.